Hi, everybody. This is David Rhodes, and welcome to another edition of In the Books, Fire Engineering's Books podcast. I'm joined today by Frank Ricci, who just finished a phenomenal piece of work, and it's called Command Presence. And don't let that title fool you, because it is not just about having command presence on an incident. This is a book that transcends the fire service. This could be on any business reading list, could be on any self-improvement reading list. It's really about how to conduct yourself and how to have influence is the biggest piece of that. So Frank and I have been friends for a very long time through fire engineering and FDIC. Frank's been an instructor at FDIC and an author for a long time. And even during that time, we both would cry on each other's shoulder a lot as our local union officials, and we would share notes. And Frank obviously is very well known for his court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court. So with that, Frank, how are you?
Dave, it's an honor to be on the show, and it's great here in New England. It's fall time, so I got the fire going, and looking forward to this.
That's outstanding. So let's dive right in and give us just a little bit of background for those who don't know you. Just a quick fire service history, and also a little history with that court case.
Okay, that's a tall order. So I started off as an explorer, like a lot of other firefighters. I just love the fire service. We had a choice when we were kids. We could be firemen, or firemen. So We got to choose where we wanted to work, but both of my brothers are firefighters. My uncle was a New York City firefighter. So, we started being an explorer, and I wanted to get hired, and I was dyslexic and had trouble reading. And I knew I needed something, Dave, to give me an edge in that hiring process. So Jack McElfish, which many people in the fire service know from Georgia, he came up from Montgomery County, Maryland, and was chief of Wallingford, Connecticut. And he got my brother to live in a firehouse in Silver Spring before he started his career. So I was like, that's going to be the magic bullet. That's what's going to get me to the next level. So I enrolled in Montgomery College, which is known as Harvard on the Pike. Francis Brannigan taught there. So it's a community college. And I lived in the firehouse, and it was amazing, all the stuff I learned from good officers and bad officers, because as you know, Dave, you go through your career, you get on one shift, then you get transferred, you go to another shift. What was really important about living in a firehouse was that you got to see all the different shifts at the same time with all the different characters, what worked, what didn't work, how this officer excelled. Somebody just last week asked me, how do you become the officer where you don't wash a dish? And I go, that's easy. You become the firefighter that never lets a officer wash their dish.
That's right.
So I got to learn hands-on in Montgomery County, in Rockville, volunteer fire department, and it was the best thing going. And from there, I got hired working for Bethesda Chevy Chase Rescue Squad inside the Beltway on an ambulance, a medic unit, and a heavy rescue. So I was living in the firehouse, running calls, and going home and living in the firehouse. So I'd go to work, go back to the firehouse and run calls. And then I got hired in Middletown, Connecticut, South District for 8 months, and I got fired for union activity. I filed an OSHA complaint as a probationary firefighter. Don't recommend anybody to do that. It was a good learning experience. Don't regret it. Not complaining, but I put myself in a position of leadership on probation. Could have waited a little bit longer and still been more effective. And I was fired. My record was expunged. And then I ended up in the city of New Haven, which was the dream department, busy department, urban department in Connecticut, has Yale, socioeconomically deprived. And I had a great career. I worked in the Dixwell section of the city on the busiest truck in the city. And, you mentioned the court case. I didn't get promoted for, I think it was 12 or 13 years. And in hindsight, it was the best thing that happened to me, because when I got promoted, I already made my mistakes acting. So,
Right.
I think acting is an important part of growing in a fire department. When you go to a fire, there's enough redundancy on the fire ground that you can build acting officers. I know some people are against acting. I think as long as it's done right, it's a vital part of growth in the fire service. And so I got promoted, and something that was really strange. It goes back to that dish thing, Dave. When I got promoted to lieutenant, they kept me on my same shift. So
Oh,
I was
that's tough.
actually supervising the individuals I worked for and worked
Yeah.
with, and I had no issues. And then eventually I got sent like a fish out of water to, I went from a black neighborhood and now I got put in an Ecuadorian neighborhood on the other side of the city. Busiest company in that battalion, but a totally different dynamic where English was a
Right.
second language, and you can go to the grocery store and get a guinea pig, and that was just part of dinner in that culture. But it was a great learning experience on communication. Really making an impact in the neighborhood. Worked with a great shift, but they were all crazy, which is
Right.
it was a senior shift, but it was crazy shift. So, we had our share of fires. And one of the funny things about writing the book is as I'm writing the book, I find myself writing about my mistakes. Like I didn't write about the fires where things went good. I was like, wow, I must have really sucked as an officer because here's this mistake and here's that mistake. And one of the things that I really wanted to focus on in the book is there's a lot of great books on the characteristics of being a leader. You know, Tons of books. But the problem is if you're reading that book, I'm going to guess you probably already have some of those characteristics. You're reading a leadership book or an influence book or an officer's book because you want to be a little bit better, right? We're not trying to be the guy or girl that we read the book from, but we're just all trying to be a little bit better. And I found a lot of those books were lacking in while those books are very important, but I found them lacking in the actual tactics and strategies that you can use to increase your influence. And so I started looking around and I said, Dave, what makes somebody a good leader? And it really came down to what I define as command presence is whether you're calm. We all worked for somebody who knew what they were doing, but weren't calm. Nobody wanted to follow that person. Um,
Right.
we also worked for people that were confident, but that weren't competent. So I brought it all down to being calm, confident, not arrogant, confident. You got to be humble a little bit, and also competent in your task. Just those three things. And I think that if you try to embody those three things, you'll succeed in any fire department or any business for that matter.
Absolutely. So, how many years did you end up doing in New Haven?
I did 22 years in New Haven, and because they wouldn't promote me and other firefighters because we were white and Hispanic, when the United States Supreme Court, when we won our court case on merit-based promotions and the necessity of that, we were actually given pension credit. So I retired at 22 years, but with a full 30-year pension from the city. So I actually did a little bit extra, gave some time back to the city because I was union president and I wanted to finish the contract. I knew that the members, the men and women in the New Haven Fire Department deserve the best contract after they give so much to the community that I wanted to make sure to see that contract through. I got that contract, and using the tactics in that book, the same tactics I used on the fire ground, that ended up being the best collective bargaining agreement for the fire department in Connecticut, hands down.
Yep. And
Dave, even
that's
the people that don't like me will tell you that my
right.
contract was pretty awesome.
Yep. So interesting. Obviously, I was in a lawsuit myself, as you're well aware. Um, it's interesting when you see your name up there on that so and so versus so and so with that federal emblem on it. It's quite scary in a way, but it's also, if you know you're doing the right thing and you're pushing for the right thing, it's a scary, proud moment. And it takes a while to get there. It's like you said, like you made that mistake early on by filing that complaint. And it wasn't that you're wrong in filing that complaint, because I'm sure whatever it is, the department or whoever was doing wrong, and you wanted to make it right. And so for guys like us who are very passionate, it's hard sometimes for us to have a strategy without going straight for the Well, if we're right, we're right, and who could be against right? But that's not the way the world works. And so, if you don't have a strategy, you can really screw yourself up. And that's what this book brings, all of these stories from all over together. And like you said, you're talking about mistakes that you survived but learned a lesson from that you could build on the next time. And I think this, especially this generation, 30 and under in the fire service, they lack a lot of experience in dealing with a lot of different things that something like this book can fill the gap somewhat. Nothing beats experience. Nothing beats experience. But when you can have these stories and these actual things that happened, you get credibility and you're able to learn from somebody else's journey, whether it was a pleasant journey or an unpleasant journey. And we
Dave,
had both.
you're 100% right. But to paraphrase Ben Franklin, experience is the best teacher, but only a fool learns in that school alone. So that experience has to be balanced, and that's one of the reasons that I reached out to some great fire engineering instructors and authors and brought them in because I wanted to put and highlight command presence in action from different perspectives from around the entire country. Some names that individuals will recognize 100%. As soon as they see the name, they'll know who Dave Rhodes is, who Mike Galliano is. But other names that are up and coming, that are reaching that pinnacle now, like Dave McGlenn and Corey Moore. So I tried to kind of not only look at the country, but also look at individuals that were there and also individuals that are working their way there that they're calm, they're confident, and they're competent, and they're great instructors, and they're delivering a very important message that needs to be heard. So I thought that would help balance the book as well and also break up. You're reading one perspective. Now all of a sudden you're getting a totally fresh perspective. And I really appreciate, the chief of Houston, Samuel, and I'll mispronounce his name and I apologize. It's Pena, correct?
I think so.
We put him in the first chapter. He's the last segment in the first chapter. And I really appreciate him stepping up and lending his voice to this work.
So one of the big leadership lessons is that you got to establish trust with your folks in order to be a leader. And you've already talked about being competent. And that's one of the things I always talk about is you got to have competence and you got to have character. And so without those two, it's hard. It's hard to be a leader and have any kind of influence. So what is it about some of these experiences that allowed you to be vulnerable enough to expose yourself in some of these situations that you felt it was important enough to get that message out there?
Well, I'm going to hit this from two parts. One, we all learn from our own mistakes, but only the wise learn from others. And Anthony Villo and I think I quoted him in my FDIC speech, my keynote, and he came up to me after and he goes, Frank, you said that when we wrote the book. I didn't say it. So, but I've gotten so much for Anthony, and he also wrote for the book. Brilliant author, brilliant command officer. But I think that we learn the most from our mistakes. And I just always been that person where I tend to put myself out front. And if you're going to put yourself out front, you're going to catch, some people are going to throw rocks at you, no matter how right or wrong you are. If you put yourself out front, there'll be a time where you feel alone and kind of like, well, wait a second, I'm doing what's right. How could this all be happening to me? But you just got to push. You got to stay the course and you got to push through it. One of the things that really opened my eyes to this is I was already an FDI instructor. I get promoted, was already teaching search in the academy, was an adjunct instructor. And on one of my first night shift on the island of Misfit Toys, we got a job. Room and contents fire, going good, out the windows with gasoline siding underneath the other siding that was enveloping, just was like a textbook fire where everything went, where at the time I thought everything went right. And force entry, took a look below the smoke, got the layout of the room, told the pipe person to hit it. We hit it. We start crawling in, and command radio that the fire was enveloping the front of the building. So I took my pipe person. I was the engine boss at the time, kind of moving them along with me. There was a big bookcase in front of the window. Still couldn't see my hand in front of my face. So I thought I was doing it right. I took my hand and I swept the bed. There was nothing on the bed. And I told Chris, he could fight Bigfoot and give him a run for his money. Chris is a big kid. He said, take the bookcase and just put it on the bed. So in like one motion, he put down the pipe and got the bookcase on the bed. After the fire was out, all searches confirmed negative. We're at the command post, and the battalion chief says, did anybody find a dog? And my heart just sunk because I said, these guys are good. They're not going to miss a dog. There was only essentially one room of substantial fire. Nobody's going to miss a dog. The dog's got to be in that room. It's on me. I missed the dog. So lo and behold, which I teach now at FDIC, is if you have to move anything during a search, always move it to the known, stable position. So we should have moved the bookcase behind us along the wall. We could have collapsed it. It was an area search. We wouldn't have covered up a door or anything. And what happened was that bookcase slid off the bed into a crevasse, probably 6 to 12 inches between the bed and the window, and covered the dog that was 3/4 below. And so now I'm like, this is my first night. I literally just caught a job 2 hours into the shift. I got one of the most senior shifts in the city that's just known from crushing banter. And I actually thought about this, Dave. I go, there's going to be a stuffed dog on the seat of the fire truck at my seat at dinner. So I was like, well, look, I could make excuses or I could just hit it head on. So in the tailboard critique, I said, hey guys, I effed up. I missed the dog. It's on me. What I could have done different was I could have moved it to a stable position that we already searched behind us. And instead of getting the banter that I was expecting, all of a sudden everybody else started opening up in the critique. And I was like, wow. And when I went to work, I really didn't get it. I actually built credibility with the shift. I didn't take away credibility. And I was like, okay. And so I wrote an article for Fire Engineering about that incident and talk about it all the time. It don't matter how good you are. We can all make a mistake, but it's all about the victims. If you miss a dog, if your department misses a dog, your department will miss a kid or a baby. So that needs to be taken very seriously. And that was 100% on me. So we just trained to be better. And then I learned from that is every critique, I always started off with what I would do different in hindsight or what I would do different pulling up to the same job. And that always got the crew to start interacting and building the shift. So I have a positive experience. People are going to hate you. They're going to hate you. It is what it is. Don't worry about them. What is it? Donald Rumsfeld said, dogs don't bark at parked cars. So you're going to be moving, you're going to make mistakes, but at least stay the course in the right direction. As for the trust thing, I want to hit this real quick. It's something I teach in my leadership classes. I call it the Facebook factor of trust. So when you said it so eloquently that, trust is really kind of that currency of being a good leader, but we all like to gossip. It's part of our DNA, especially as firefighters. So that's what's so great about FDIC and elsewhere. If you have to tell somebody a story, tell somebody that you hooked up with at FDIC. I could call Dave McGlenn and say, hey, Dave, look, this is what happened at work. Because if I'm talking to Dave McGlenn and he's in Pennsylvania, the names don't matter anymore.
Right.
Where if you're telling that story at work, if you're a boss and you become part of the rumor mill, well, now all of a sudden you're eroding your credibility. And what I found is this is how the Facebook factor of trust works. Me and you are good friends. So I say, Dave, I need you to keep this right between me and you. And you have a little bit of respect for me. So you say, Frank, I'm not going to tell anybody. Well, you tell your two closest friends. You're not going to tell everybody. You're not going to put it on Facebook. You're just going to tell your two closest friends. And then what happens is it's like a pyramid. They tell their two closest friends. And now all of a sudden they're kind of removed from you. They don't even know you. So now they tell 6 people before you know it's on Facebook. So I think conferences like FDIC, not only going to the classrooms, but also talking to your peers, talking to your mentors, talking to just the firefighters, you kind of can talk about rumor mill and without naming the names.
Right. You need that outside circle of advisors or shoulders to cry on, whatever you want to call it, because again, you don't need to know the names. They just need to know the circumstances, and they can give you advice back. Well, you took the bait perfectly, because what I was getting at is one of the most effective ways to build trust is to show your vulnerability. And by saying, hey, I screwed up and here's why, then your crew showed their vulnerability too and told you all the ways they screwed up at the same fire. Now, if I had been on your crew, you would have got that same thing from me, but there would have been a stuffed dog in the bed at some point. I can guarantee you that for sure. So tell me a little bit, in your introduction, the greatest evil is indifference. So let's talk about that a little bit.
That was on my refrigerator as a kid. So on my refrigerator, there was a sign as a little kid that said the greatest evil is indifference. And essentially what my parents taught us, my mother and father, is that if words were important enough to be spoken, then action was needed. So we weren't allowed to complain about things. They expected that if you're going to complain about something, you kind of had to have a plan on what you were going to do to change it and make it better. So that is something that always stood with me. And, a lot of people talk about, character is what you do when nobody's looking. And that kind of morphed into what a leader is. And I find that to be a disservice to anybody who's going to be a leader. I find that leadership is what you do when everybody's looking, because that's when it's hard and that's when the mistakes are made. So I wanted to make sure that you're always being watched as a boss. The old saying of what you let go becomes the new minimum standard. But whether you're a boss or that senior firefighter, how you carry yourself matters. My cousin's starting a new job this week, and he goes, "Oh, any advice?" I said, "Yes. In the industry that you're in, when you get promoted to a manager one day, 6 years from now, you're going to be managing the very same people you work with. So don't get stuck in the rut. Don't complain about people, and be the employee that you would want to manage. Because if not, it's going to get thrown right in your face as soon as you become a boss. And no matter how competent you are, you're not going to be an effective leader."
Yep. And you said earlier, when you got promoted, you got put over the shift that you actually worked on. Like, we didn't even do that in Atlanta. So that's an interesting, I guess it happened every now and then, depending on who you were and who you knew at the time, if you wanted to stay there. But even if you did want to, which most people probably do because they don't quite get it, especially like your first promotion. But man, that's a setup. It is actually better for you to move on.
Well, the
somewhere
hilarious thing is, so then when they did shuffle the deck and they sent me to Fairhaven, there's 40 shifts in the city, 10 firehouses. So 40 shifts I could have went to. They sent me to the shift with the president of the Firebirds, who called me the White Devil. So I'm supervising somebody who has attacked my integrity, and I have to lead him the same way I lead everybody else. We ended up becoming friends. And also my first cousin was on the shift. So it was like this really crazy dynamic, but I learned a lot, and I had as everybody says, and I'll ask you, because you were a battalion chief. I look back on my career, the most fun I had was a firefighter and being a lieutenant on the job. Yeah. The responsibility just gets too high as you go up.
Yeah. Tillerman driving the truck was probably the best. I had some good times as a captain and as a battalion chief, but as far as pure fun, absolutely. There's nothing like being a truck driver, especially on the back, because you're just jumping off, grabbing your hook, and going straight in to do your thing. It's awesome. Couple of little pieces in here that are great titles, great chapter headings, by the way. Let's talk a little bit about getting and giving a cigar.
So this is great. We could kind of tie it back to that first story. New Haven has this great thing, and when you get yelled at or you do something wrong, they call it, and this goes back, I think, to the 30s, they call it getting a cigar. And it's kind of a way, it kind of takes a sting out of saying you messed up. So instead of saying, "Hey, I messed this up," you just say, oh yeah, I got a cigar. And when I became drill master for the department, I used to call my office the humidor because I was always causing mayhem. But yeah, it's just simply a way to say that you messed up is, hey, I got a cigar, or I'm giving somebody a cigar. And it's just one of those New Haven lore. We don't know where it actually came from, but it's been in New Haven
Part of the
forever. And
culture.
I hope it's a tradition that carries on.
Yeah, that's a good one. One of the things we used to have was, and obviously times changed rapidly with a lot of the HR policies and all, but the old way of solving problems in our department was you went to the hose tower and you had a fight, and you actually literally duked it out, and then after that everything was good. I mean, you got your point across. There was either a winner or a loser or a draw, and I'm sure it's still said today, but obviously during my career, there wasn't an official or unofficial allowance of fights, but people would be mouthing at each other and all, and that phrase was still there. It'd be like, hey, take it to the hose tower. And and some people would walk outside and talk a little bit to kind of get out of your hair or whatever. But in the old days, they just fought it out, and then things were worked out quite well under that system. Ironically, I read an article or read a chapter in a book with some of the special forces, and they were talking about they had the beef circle, and at the end of the day, they circled around and they said, all right, anybody have a problem with anybody's performance today or anything they did? And like somebody would speak up and they would say, all right, come on, get in the middle of the circle. And they no headshots and whatever. You could wrestle, you could box, you could do whatever. And it solved so many problems. And it built such good cohesion that after about the first week, they said nobody had a problem with each other, but people were just calling each other out just to see who was the baddest in the wrestling match.
Unfortunately and fortunately, we are a kinder fire service and business environment out there. And, one of the rules I had as a lieutenant, because I always used to really focus on my senior personnel to let them handle the small stuff, is, if it affects civilian safety, firefighter safety, or the reputation of the fire department, then I need to know about it. And
right.
those are three kind of really quick things that if you're going to empower your senior personnel to run your shift, say in the firehouse, that's a good thing. Hey, if it's going to affect the reputation of the fire department, if it's going to affect civilian safety or firefighter safety, I need to know about it. That's a good rule, and it helps build your personnel.
Yeah. Other than that, let the senior man take you off to the side and have a good talk with you. Another one that I like, and I'm sure there's a lot of material here. Negotiations, getting what you want. That's what everybody wants, right?
Everything you want in life is either owned or controlled by somebody else. And yet we are horrible as firefighters and as people just negotiating. I mean, just like the very simple tactic. And I encourage, regardless of what your politics is, it's from Canada, so I think it's great. There's an individual, he's running for prime minister. He's eating an apple, and they ask him a question, and it's a master class in negotiation. So when somebody brings to you a position, they make a statement or ask you a question, don't answer it. Stop. Be calm. Ask them a question. By just asking them a question, what you'll generally do is put them on their back foot. You'll de-escalate a little bit, but you'll also narrow their position to find weakness. Now, this guy in the video, I'll have Mark put a link up to it because it's worth seeing. He just asks question after question after question, but it's a key way to disarm people in negotiations. I found that the key to good negotiations, Dave, and you probably know as a union president, and I included you in this chapter because what you came up with, I thought was brilliant with that no confidence vote on a piece of equipment instead of an individual. I thought that was brilliant. I remembered that story you told me in Tulsa probably like 6 years or so when I called and said, I need this story in the book. But negotiations really comes down to planning, having a strategy and laying out how are you going to get from A to B. You need to stop playing checkers and start playing chess. Sometimes at a fire, for size up, you need to make almost the perfect decision based off imperfect information. You don't want to keep changing because you'll look like a squirrel and next thing you know, you get run over.
Right.
However, anything administratively, whether it's in the firehouse or in negotiations, it's not on fire. Slow it down. Take a good look. You're playing chess, and a chess master said, when you see a good move, look for a better one. You can't do that on the fire ground, but you can definitely do that administratively. And that's one of the problems we have in our service is that administratively, we think we need to handle things the same way and with the same speed and efficiency at a fire. No, you need to slow it down. You need to read the controlling documents that are affecting whatever issue you're doing. Dot the I's, cross the T's, do it right and do it right first, and don't establish bad facts. And, you mentioned the Supreme Court case. That was one of the gifts of that Supreme Court case is that when we started, we never knew that our houses would be on the line, all 20 of us, and that we'd be looking at a Supreme Court case. We just knew that the issue was sensitive and that people cared about the issue, even that had good faith opinions on the other side of it. And we knew that we couldn't afford to establish any bad facts. So we took our time and we planned out every move. And that's really what negotiations is. Slow it down, make sure you can see the whole entire board, because what you're going to find is if you're looking at things kind of like a game, you can master that game.
Right. Do you find, I think some people jump into a negotiation or even on a lower end, just a conversation about an issue or whatever that you got a disagreement with somebody on. It's kind of natural to just sort of paint them as the bad guy or the bad person or whatever. But if you go in to a conversation or a negotiation and you communicate to them as if they are the bad guy, you've already lost. And so you got to do your homework and you got to put yourself in their position, because 9 times out of 10, maybe it was a bad decision, but that doesn't mean that they're a bad person. And maybe they're bound by some practice, or they just made a mistake, or they did something that was just wrong, and you're calling them out on it. So you got to figure out why they made that decision first. And that was one of my things I always said, especially with the politicians, is like, you can go in there and hammer them all day long, and all they're going to do is dig in further. But if you go in there with the issue and you lay out your facts and your position, and you're credible to them, you're respectful to them, and you always leave them a way out. That was like the key. You give them an escape hatch, and sometimes, hopefully, they'll come up with their own, and they know how to do it. But if you provide the escape hatch for them, then that's almost like showing a little vulnerability too. And you start to build a little bit of trust. And he's like, okay, he's not trying to crucify me here. He's just making a point. And you want him to see your side of the facts too. But you have to think about the fact that there's some reason they made that decision. And it may not have been out of spite or out of negligence. It could just simply be they didn't have all the information at the time and they made a bad decision. Because we do it all the time. You wrote however many 13 chapters about mistakes, right?
Very well said. And I'll give you 2 examples. So the individual, Victor Bolden, who was on the opposite side of our United States Supreme Court case, was the legal director for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. He was brought in to be the face of New Haven, to be corporation counsel, to argue against us. And Victor and I got along famously because I knew he had a job to do, but he was a consummate professional, and he never let it get personal. And we never got personal. We always communicated with each other, even if we were going at each other on Lou Dobbs or Sean Hannity. We would do the split screens arguing. We always kept it personal, and people were amazed because, Victor's a Democrat and I'm a staunch conservative. But when we won and the Supreme Court issued the ruling, Victor Bolden got nominated by President Obama to be a Superior Court judge. And I provided testimony before the Senate to get him confirmed. And people were like blown away. Like, how could and I was like, because he followed the law. He had a job to do. You have to, whenever you're thinking with your heart, you're not thinking with your head. It's just
Yep.
like being a chief. If you're working with your hands, you're not working with your head. So you can work with your hands in training, but if you're in the chief and your job is to be looking at what's going on, you got to make sure you know that your radio is your tool, but you shouldn't have a tool in your hand forcing a door or pulling a ceiling. You're diminishing your own command. However, there are times, and I like to say, where you got to hit somebody with a bat. And that doesn't mean literally hit them with a bat. That means use just brutal, honest truth, but also give the person a way out. So to give you an example, I had an issue with our mayor on a staffing issue. I knew exactly what you said. If I attacked the mayor, she was going to dig in and we weren't going to get anywhere and we were going to lose the company. So what we did was we came up with a plan. We came up with a press plan. And in the end, we always use what I say, ESP. Always start off with the emotional argument. Try to get some kind of agreement with the person you're talking to, then move to standards and statistics. And then the P is professionalism and persistence. And what we would find is that if somebody's the decision maker, there is always somebody else that's behind that person, that's usually number 2 or number 3, that's giving them bad information. So we would attack number 2, not attack physically, attack to just make it perfectly clear that this individual is giving the mayor the wrong information. I mean, in one ad, we took an ad, half-page ad in the paper, and we photoshopped in the emergency director talking on the radio saying, "Don't worry, I live in Orange," which is another town. So he probably had a voodoo doll of me after that. But in the end, he understood that, hey, this wasn't personal. This was business. So sometimes you got to hit it head on, but you're 100% right. And there's brilliance in what you said, Dave. You got to leave the decision maker an out. And you don't ever paint somebody a bad guy that's not a bad guy. But one thing I've learned about City Hall dwellers and City Hall creatures, there's more than enough bad guys that are agreeing with these bad decisions that are putting policy pressure. Find the one that's worse and expose them. Expose the truth. Hit them with the bat.
Yep. And then if you gotta go further, hopefully you can negotiate and get your point across and have resolution without going to court. But that's the great thing about the country is you always have that option. It's going to be expensive and it's going to be time consuming. It takes years to get through that process, but it's worth it in the end, so that you can get all of the truth out there. So were there any surprises? I know you had a lot of contributors to the book. Was there anything that surprised you that somebody actually told the story, or it was just such a good example of what you were doing that you didn't know before you started the book?
I'll give you one, and it's from the think tank world, because I work for a think tank, which is just mind blowing because I couldn't even spell think tank when I was in high school. So my boss was going on a radio show. I think it was a national radio show. And my boss, Harvard graduate, brilliant, was the editor of the Harvard Law Review. But she's a visionary. Some people are visionaries and some people are in the weeds. She's a visionary, and everything was moving quick. And I didn't want her to miss the time. So I was getting on the phone, and I put this in the book. I put the quote in the book, not the story. And I was getting on the phone to call her a reminder. And Bryce Chenault goes, "Frank, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm going to call Carol and just remind her about a radio interview today because I don't want her to miss it." He goes, "Stop." He goes, "Because you can't micromanage the boss." And I go, "I'm just trying to make sure every train's run on time here." He goes, "Here, try this. Send her a text that says, 'Hey, Carol, I'm looking forward to seeing you on the radio at 4:00 today.'" And I was like, that's brilliant. How many bosses in the fire service micromanage people to check up on them? And then as soon as they leave the office, the guy's saying, "Oh, what a jerk. He knows I'm getting this done." When he or she could just simply say, "Hey, I'm looking forward to your presentation on Friday. How you making out?" Now, all of a sudden, it changes that whole entire dynamic. And that was like the last quote I added into the book was from Bryce. I said, that's brilliant, because just that soft touch of dealing with employees and empowering them instead of like you're checking up on them, that could make a big difference. And that's what this book's about. It's about tactics and strategies. You can take away the tactics and say, hey, I can apply this to whatever I do to just be a little bit better. One of the other things that I talked about in the book that really bother me is I'll ask in a leadership class, I'll say, as a leader, do you ever ask a question without knowing the answer? And so many people say yes. And I'm like, do you realize that that comes from the legal world? And lawyers, when they say that, they only say that because they already asked the question in depositions. Right. So they're not asking a question they didn't ask in depositions. But the business world took that as in, to be competent, you need to be all-knowing and not ask questions.
It's impossible.
You're a fool. You got to ask questions. That's how you're getting information. So in negotiations, okay, this is groundbreaking for people in the fire service. They think command presence is giving those short, concise directions on a fire ground. True. In negotiations, in administrative, anything else, it's the one who's talking the least has the command presence, and the one that's asking the questions to get the right information to make the right decisions. Slow it down. So yes, I ask questions all the time that I don't know the answer to. Don't conflate what a lawyer says just because it's a nice soundbite and actually create a weakness for yourself. You want to be asking questions all the time as a boss, or you're going to be getting the wrong information.
Yep. And good dialogue and good dialogue and negotiations is almost like research. Where they say, as soon as you finish a research project, what do you need? More research, because you've come up with more questions. So if you ask a question, you're going to get an answer, which is going to spur at least 2 more questions. And that's how you get a dialogue going so that you can work through an issue. For any of you haven't noticed, you can apply these to your relationships also. These are great tips. Anybody that's been married for a long time already knew pretty much everything that was in the book, Frank. If their marriage was successful and had stayed together, you've learned all these negotiations.
In the fire service, most marriages aren't, and Mike and Ann are doing everything they can to strengthen them.
Yeah, I've been lucky in that category too, so that's been a good one. All right, so what do you? Obviously, this was a project that took quite a while. Was this your first book?
This was my first book. I had the honor to write for Billy Goldfeder, to write for the Seattle guys. Pretty much every book that came out, either somebody would ask me to get pictures or write a page. So, so this was my first book actually putting through. And, the guy behind the curtain here on The Wizard of Oz is Mark Ha. Mark Ha was one of those individuals who said, you really got to tell a story. And of course, Bobby Halton was the one who really kept on me saying, Frank, when are you going to write this? When are you going to write this? So thanks to Bobby. And, just as a note, these are Bobby's last published words in the book. He didn't actually get to see the book come out, but it was his last published words. And the book was something that he believed in and was really pushing to think that other people could learn just a little bit to get a little bit better.
So what is the biggest takeaway you want people to get from reading this book?
I want them to be able to, what makes me the happiest is when somebody sends me the book in the mail and says, sign the book, send it back to me. And I use this tactic and it worked. I'm not trying to recreate. The worst thing I've seen in the fire service and in the business world is somebody reads a book and then the next week they come to work and they're that person. That's not what this book is about. This book is to,
they got notes on their hand.
Oh, it's horrible. This book is
to say,
you're going to be able to apply these tactics and be able to use some of these tactics to make yourself a little bit better. And when that happens, that's the highest praise. And it was such an honor of having all these people write for the book. And Bobby Halton called it out for what it was. He goes, Frank, what is this, a Tom Sawyer project? You're not even going to have to write anything. You got all these people on here. But no, seriously, I just want everybody, if you're a boss, this book is not going to bore you with the characteristics of saying you got to be honest, you got to be trustworthy, you got to be this. This is, hey, here's a story. Here are some tactical takeaways that you can apply to essentially any situation that's within the 4 corners of this, and you'll make yourself a little bit more effective. Like I say, it's just going to be a matter of time before you find yourself as a leader standing in front of a room of people that don't agree with you, standing with a camera in your face from the press or standing in the jury box or at a deposition. And I wanted to kind of give those tactics to kind of talk about those things that aren't often talked about in books. You know, we cover command, we cover size up, but we also cover, hey, what should you be doing when you get your first deposition? Because you don't have to be a union president or a company officer to find yourself at a deposition. It helps to kind of have a little bit of framework of, hey, this is how it works. So,
yep, absolutely. Well, man, I think we've covered it pretty good, and I just want to encourage everybody. It's a beautiful book. They did a great job with it. Pretty decent looking guy on the front of it. It's Command Presence, Increase Your Influence. It's going to help you out. It's a different type of leadership book. Again, as Frank said, it's not step one, step two. It's actual real things that happened and lessons learned that you can certainly put in your bank of knowledge and refer back to, and it's probably going to make you realize that you've had very similar situations, and maybe you just didn't learn the lesson from it, or you didn't realize what a learning opportunity it was. And anytime you can get some words of wisdom from folks who have been there and got the scars, it's an absolute gem. So you can get a copy at Fire Engineering Books, and actually you can get it anywhere, but Fire Engineering Books is the easiest way to jump on the website and order it. It's Frank Ricci. It's been out for, I guess it came out at FDIC, right, in April?
At FDIC. And Dave, it's been an honor being on the show, and thank you so much for contributing to this book, because your contribution made this book just a little bit better.
I appreciate it. So thanks everybody for listening. I'm David Rose with Frank Ricci, and we'll see you next time. This one's in the books.